First of all, there is no godless constitution. It's a false claim. First, the Constitution is incorporated as part of our fundamental law alongside the Declaration of Independence. The Constitution states in the subscription clause in our 12th year, which is a direct reference to 1776 and the nation's charter, the Declaration of Independence. These two documents cannot be separated. They are one. The Declaration is our birth certificate, and the Constitution our governing document. There are multiple Christian references in the Declaration, such as laws of nature and nature's God, supreme judge and divine providence, and the supreme judge is capitalized, which means it's a direct reference to God, whereas in the Constitution, Supreme Court is lowercase, court is a higher case. Also, the concluding paragraph of the Declaration is a prayer for God's justice and mercy, laying the groundwork for further prayers and appeals to God for the welfare of the nation. Secondly, the founders studied many political and legal philosophers who guided them in the development of the Constitution, but the three most frequently mentioned in the Federalist Papers by John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison are Montesquieu, a French philosopher who gave the framework for the three separate branches of government: executive, judicial, and legislative. Also, Blackstone was the second most frequently mentioned in commentaries on the laws of England, and John Locke was the third most frequently mentioned, second treatise on government. Also, during this era, Samuel Rutherford's Lex Rex, the law is king, was widely distributed in the colonies leading up to the American Revolution. Lex Rex is a strictly theological book which denies the divine right of kings, saying that the king and the citizens are subject to the same law. Rutherford was a prominent Presbyterian theologian and pastor and was commissioner at the Westminster Assembly, which gave us the Westminster Confession. Thirdly, as far as the Christian or biblical references to the Constitution itself, there are two. In the year of our Lord. So there is a mention of God in the Constitution itself, Dr. Silverman. Article 1, Section 7 links Christianity by exempting Sunday, the Sabbath, as a day to be counted for the president to veto legislation. It was not counted because it was the Sabbath. Yes, there is a recognition of the Christian Sabbath written into the document of the Constitution. The framework and structure of the Old Testament model for the separation between the offices of prophet, priest, and king, as reflected in Isaiah 32:22, quote, says, "For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king, he will save us," end quote. Montesquieu referenced that text, and as well as others, and this is where they basically came up with the separation of powers, or the checks and balances. Jesus also made reference to a jurisdictional separation of church and state, and most Christians that I know believe in a jurisdictional separation of church and state, but not a moral or ethical or spiritual separation. He said, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." The Constitution is surely an implicit Christian document reflecting a Christian worldview, if you must insist that it is not an explicit Christian document. One final note. The American Revolution could have ended similar as the French Revolution if they had wanted to copy revolutionary and Enlightenment ideas prevalent at the time, as had been set forth by the atheists Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and other Enlightenment philosophers. But they remained in the flow of Western Christian ideals. The French Revolution began in 1789 and abolished the Christian calendar to set up French history in 1793 as year one, whereas all of history prior to that, for 1,800 years, had dated history from the birth of Christ. They closed churches, abolished Sunday, killed clergy, guillotined tens of thousands, and had a clear policy to de-Christianize and convert France into a secular, godless state. which I think is the goal of many of our opponents in this debate. The contrast between the American and French revolutions was so stark that the great member of Parliament in England, Edmund Burke, condemned the French Revolution in his famous book, Reflections on the French Revolution. Burke supported the American Revolution, though he was a British member of Parliament. Reflections is considered today as one of the 100 important books in Western civilization. Finally, for Christians, nothing is godless if it's sanctified by prayer and consecration. There were prayers and sermons offered for the delegates early in the proceedings. Ben Franklin called on the Constitutional Convention to set aside a period of prayer because they had had deliberations and there was acrimony and bickering going on, and they set aside on his call, and he was the least religious of the founders on June 28, 1787. At Washington's inauguration in 1789, he said in his address, "My first duty as president is fervent supplications." So I believe that we can set aside the idea that the Constitution is godless. Dr. Silverman brings up the idea that Article 6 of the Constitution says there'll be no religious test for federal office. I agree with that. And by the way, it was the Puritans and many of the Baptist leaders of the time who made these demands. They did not want a religious test because it might contradict one of the ones required in their respective states. Further, they did not believe the federal government had any jurisdiction on religious matters. That's what the First Amendment is all about. And such men as Ellsworth, John Leland, if there are any Baptists here, is the great Baptist leader that's reverenced by so many, who had a hand in the Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty, which Madison and Jefferson put forth in 1786. So the elimination of a religious test for holding office is based upon the activity of Christians at that time. Well, I think I'll save the separation of church and state myth for maybe another question, but I want to briefly address the Tripoli Treaty of 1797. Even a blind squirrel can find an acorn every now and then. And this is about the only document that those who deny our Christian heritage or founding can find. The Treaty of Tripoli in 1787 allegedly has this quote: "The government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion." And there's been circulation of this treaty that Washington signed it. Dr. Silverman has already noted that it was signed by John Adams in June of 1797. Some believe that this is an insertion into the treaty. There are possible explanations that there were translation errors from the official who negotiated the treaty, John Barlow, in February of 1797. And there was a Dutch Arabic scholar who did a different translation in 1930, and there were different aspects. Article 11 may not have been in the treaty, according to the encyclopedia book, Treaties and Other International Agreements of the United States in 1776. It says there's a mystery and an uncertainty about whether this phrase is really in the treaty. It's possible, and we're speculating here because many of the scholars do debate over this, that the Dey, or the local governor of Algiers, added the phrase in a note to mollify the concerns of the Pasha of Tripoli, I guess that's the president or the king of Tripoli, about an Islamic nation negotiating with an infidel nation, the United States. And a private letter may have been inserted and translated alongside the actual treaty that had been negotiated. American officials, eager to make peace with Tripoli, allowed this letter to go forward under false pretenses. And if the phrase is legitimate, and I can, just for the sake of argument, it may have been a U.S. effort to accommodate Islam by saying the United States is not a Christian nation, like the European nations, where there is a total merging or blending of church and state. Whereas in the USA, Christianity is not an officially sponsored government religion.